Alright, so today I want to answer 10 frequently asked questions about ball pythons, and essentially what I did is I compiled a really big list of frequently asked questions and I kind of narrowed it down to some of the more interesting questions that you may or may not know the answer to. Some of them are kind of interesting, whether you are a beginner snake keeper or an experienced keeper of ball pythons. Hopefully you'll find some of these questions interesting. Alright, so the number one question is, how old is the oldest ball python on record? And I'd say most people, when they're thinking about getting a pet for their kids, they're thinking, alright, after my kids grow up and move out of the house, am I going to be stuck with this animal, taking care of this animal here in my house? As a matter of fact, if you wanted a really short-term animal for your kids, you could probably buy something like a mouse that only lives about a year or a year and a half. Mice age pretty much 100 times faster than we do. It's pretty amazing. But if you actually pick up a ball python, you're wondering how long they live, you actually can go over to the internet and do a quick search. Most websites will say they live between 20 and 30 years, but the oldest one that is on record for the longest life that I know of is actually a ball python that lived in the Philadelphia Zoo, lived for 48 years. It's pretty incredible. Alright, so the number two question is, how long can a ball python survive without food? And this probably comes to mind every time your snake goes off of food and starts going into a fast. As a matter of fact, I've seen some people start panicking after a couple of weeks. It's like, hey, my snake hasn't eaten for a whole month and I'm worried that something's going to happen to my ball python that it hasn't eaten for so long. As a matter of fact, going off food for a month is not really a big deal when it comes to ball pythons. As a matter of fact, the longest one that I've had go on a really long fast here in my collection was a year and a half with no food at all. As a matter of fact, the longest I've ever heard anywhere on the internet is 2 years without food. Alright, so the number three question is, can I handle my ball python every day? And that is kind of an interesting question because I've seen a lot of people say you definitely shouldn't handle it every day, and some people do actually handle ball pythons every single day. As a matter of fact, I started making videos with Bobby here, my bamboo ball python, and it seems like ever since I started handling him every day for my videos, he has become super tame, really a mellow snake. As a matter of fact, I think it has really benefited our relationship handling this snake every day. I say I'd probably handle him anywhere between usually half hour to 45 minutes shooting these videos, and it seems like he is perfectly fine. As a matter of fact, he seems like he really looks forward to getting out of these tubs behind me and getting up on my shoulder and just crawling around and checking it out. I would say you definitely can handle your ball python every single day. So the number three question is, can I put more than one ball python in a single enclosure? And I'd say this is probably the biggest question when you're first starting out in ball pythons. But essentially, a lot of people buy some really high-end rack systems, like the racks I have behind me. These are ARS racks, really expensive racks. And you get to the point where you fill up your racks and you're like, all right, I have some money for another ball python, but I just don't have the rack space. And wouldn't it be nice if I could start doubling up my snakes to save on the cost of the enclosures? And I would say it's not really a good idea to put more than one ball python together. Probably the number one reason is because they can go on a fast. When you put them together, they can go on the breeding fast. And when I start pairing up my snakes during the breeding season, you find a lot of snakes will actually go off of food because it kind of triggers the breeding season. And if you have more than one snake in an enclosure, it could really trigger that breeding fast, which you definitely don't want, especially with ball pythons that can be really picky in the first place. Although I have seen some people successfully put more than one ball python in a single enclosure, and pretty much from what I've heard, they pretty much put them together right from birth when they're really small and kind of grow them up together in that same enclosure and then separate them to feed and then put them back together in the enclosure. It actually works for some people, but I wouldn't recommend it. Alright, so question number 5 is, do ball pythons need any type of nutritional supplements? And depending on what type of reptile you have, certain reptiles need a vitamin supplement or a calcium supplement. And fortunately for ball pythons, if you're feeding rodents like rats or mice or African soft furs, it is 100% complete diet. Although if you feed baby chickens, little chicks, they actually don't have enough calcium because essentially their bones are hollow. They don't get enough calcium calcium, and you can actually supplement that food with a calcium supplement. Although I'd say most people don't feed ball pythons baby chicks. I'd say most people stick to a strictly rodent diet. All right, so question number 6 is how many eggs can a ball python lay? And I would say it really depends on the size of the ball python and the age. Pretty much the maximum number of eggs that I've ever seen for any ball python is 16 eggs. Pretty incredible. I've actually had one in my collection here lay a clutch of 13 eggs, which is pretty much my record, but I'd say on average, they lay usually between 6 and 7 eggs per clutch of eggs. All right, so number 7 is how often will a ball python shed its skin? And I'd say it really depends on the size of the snake and the age of the snake. So typically I'd say on average, smaller ball pythons will shed every 3 to 4 weeks. Larger ball pythons pretty much every 6 to 8 weeks. That's pretty much the average. Although I found that it really depends on how much you feed your snakes. So if you feed pretty much a lot more frequent feedings, you'll actually find your snakes shed a lot more frequently. If a ball python's going on a really long fast, sometimes it won't shed for a really long time. All right, so question number 8 is, do ball pythons need UV light? And some reptiles actually need UV light to produce vitamin D3, and then they use the vitamin D3 to help absorb calcium into their bones. And luckily, ball pythons don't need any type of special light. Some people use an overhead light for an extra heat source, but it doesn't have to be of a specific wavelength. They don't need UV light. All right, so question number 9 is, why did my ball python hiss at me? And I would say there's pretty much 2 behaviors for ball pythons. There is biting and hissing when it comes to an unhappy ball python. And I'd say pretty much across the board for adult ball pythons, then I'd say most will hiss at you before they'll bite you. Although on my hatchlings, it's pretty much 50-50. Sometimes they'll hiss and sometimes they'll bite me. And I'd say really it depends on how friendly and tame that ball python is. So I found that if you have a really friendly ball python like Bobby here around my shoulders, Bobby has never hissed at me, never bit me or anything. He is a super friendly ball python. The only time I really get hissed at is when I'm picking up hatchlings or I pick up some snakes that aren't really used to being handled. Sometimes they'll hiss at me, or if I'm pulling a female off of a clutch of eggs. Those are the times when a ball python is not happy and it will hiss at me. So question number 10 is, can ball pythons be attached to their owners? And I would say you take a look at Bobby here, how friendly this snake is, super friendly. And you would think he'd be really attached to me, but I think he is not really just attached to me. I think he is just really a friendly snake. As a matter of fact, if I gave him to anyone else, I can almost guarantee that this snake would be as friendly with you as it is with me. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Jas asks, how can you have 3 genes in a ball python? I thought you could only have a maximum of 2. And that is a very good question. Essentially, we're talking about when you can only have 2 copies of a gene. That is 2 copies of the same gene or genes in the same allelic complex, which gets a little bit confusing, I'd say. So for example, for the lesser gene, you can only have 2 copies of the lesser gene in any one ball python. And then if you had other genes in the same complex, like lesser or Mojave or bamboo, you couldn't have all 3 of those in the same snake. You can only have 2 of those genes in any one particular ball python. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. All right, so the number 3 question is, can I house one? All right, so the number 3 question is, can I house one? All right, so the number 3 question is, can I house more than one ball python together in an enclosure? I don't know what Bobby's doing here on my face again, but you know, I'd say. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Jas asks, how can a ball python have 3 genes? I thought it could only have a maximum of 2 genes. And that is a very good question. Essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about a maximum of 2 genes, it can only be 2 of the same or similar gene. So for example, if you had a lesser ball python, you could only have 2 copies of the lesser gene in any one ball python. Or if it is in the same complex, in the same location on the genetics. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Christopher Dewar asks, what do I think about power feeding, and does it cut down on the lifespan of the snake? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, pretty much every article that I've ever read, I've read quite a few scientific articles that say the lifespan of an animal is directly proportional to the amount of food you eat. So they say if you want to live really long, you can eat really small meals, stay really skinny, and you can live a lot longer, which I think is kind of interesting. And I think that translates over to snakes and pretty much any other animal. If you start feeding them real heavy, and it's pretty much, I think you have like a finite amount of life in you, and if you start feeding yourself or an animal even more, essentially what it does is it burns up those years. Alright, so in this video I want to give you some options for your first fall. Alright, so today I want to show you how to successfully feed your ball python hatchlings. Probably one of the toughest things when it comes to ball pythons. And alright, I'm just going to run through this one. Alright, so today I'm going to cover 12 rookie mistakes that a lot of new snake owners make. As a matter of fact, you don't have to be new into snakes to make a lot of these mistakes. And when I first started into snakes, alright, the number 6 pro when it comes to snakes is that they don't need any shots or vaccinations, which is pretty awesome. Probably one of the biggest things I like about breeding snakes. I actually bred a few, so the number 9 con when it comes to having a pet snake is that there's only one thing on the menu when it comes to snakes, and that is rodents. They eat rodents, and that is a hurdle that a lot of people can't get over. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of people that, don't really like to